As I stand here today, I cannot but remember and pay tribute to my good friend and brother, Jake Otanka Obechebi Lamte, the first president of the Advertising Association of Ghana, for his pioneering role and immense contribution in developing the advertising industry in Ghana. I know with all confidence that Jake would have loved to witness what is a culmination of years of hard work in projecting Ghana and Africa in the world of advertising and communications. I hope the industry finds a way of keeping his legacy alive, especially all his timeless efforts at spearheading the industry. May his soul rest peacefully in the bosom of the Lord. Ladies and gentlemen, I am particularly intrigued by the standing theme of this conference, Africa Rising. Indeed, we are at the cusp of a defining period in the history of the African continent. Throughout the ages, Africa has been given all sorts of unsavory accolades: backward, hopeless, poor, fraught with diseases, and what have you. For decades, Africa only seemed to fall behind the rest of the world. But today, the narrative is changing. Africa is indeed rising. After years of slow growth, Africa has a real chance to join the rest of the world in lifting its people out of poverty. The potential of Africa to create opportunities for trade and economic prosperity is gaining traction. The opportunities are real and the possibilities endless. As you may have witnessed in your travels across the continent, Africa is home to some of the most spectacular scenes that nature bequeathed to this planet. Africa holds 65% of the world's arable land and approximately 30% of the Earth's remaining natural resources. Many African countries have burgeoning populations with improving education levels and a growing middle class. Over 60% of Africa's population today had not been born in 1990, making Africa the continent with the youngest population in the world. Africa also continues to be a continent of rapid technological innovation and adoption. Obstacles facing the continent in areas such as banking, education, and farming throw up calls for tech entrepreneurs to create a solution, and young Africans are responding. Ladies and gentlemen, ours is a continent of very high potentials, and the hopes and opportunities needed to leapfrog Africa's development are here with us. We can no longer allow the challenges of yesteryears to obscure our vision for a brighter African future. Indeed, a new African personality is imminent. The urgent responsibility for leaders and businesses on the continent is to harness these potentials to create the Africa we want to see. It is my firm belief that harnessing the potential of Africa calls for an education and skills revolution to meet the human resources needs for inspiring Africa's growth. Investing in Africa's young people by giving them the skills they need for the future is perhaps one of the smartest strategies for accelerating progress on the continent. In Ghana, our aspirations to engender development through human resource development is echoed through the introduction of free senior high school policy to make basic and secondary education accessible to all Ghanaian children. This is born out of the realization that all efforts aimed at propelling socio-economic growth will fail if the country does not have a skilled and educated workforce pushing the frontiers of development. It is our expectation that in the next few years, Ghana will have strong human capital to drive its own socio-economic activities and also be in a position to export human resources. I am confident that this will create a firm foundation on which to propel the Ghana Beyond Aid agenda and achieving our destiny as a country. We in Ghana have set the pace, and I encourage my compatriots on the continent to equally implement policies that strengthen the human capital base. Beyond this, my government is implementing policies that will empower the private sector and empower local businesses to be globally competitive. I throw a challenge to you as professionals in communication to partner government to ensure the gains of Ghana Beyond Aid. I throw a challenge to you as professionals in communication to partner government to ensure that the gains of Ghana Beyond Aid can be amplified for the benefits and understanding of all. Ladies and gentlemen, it is in doing this that we can establish an African narrative that is more positive. While our human capital is rising to be the best, businesses are also evolving. Evolving because the consumer is also evolving. The early concepts of a hypodermic needle theory, where the consumer was deemed to be passive, now the consumer is more engaging and fluid in his or her decision making. The burden now lies with brands, a call to arms, reinvent or die. And as brand champions and business leaders, you have a distinctive role to play in communicating the renewed and improved prospects of Africa and the new African brand. I charge you, my friends, to play a more assertive role in projecting an Africa that is rising and that is ready to tackle the challenges of the 21st century head on. I encourage you to share the learnings from this conference so all of Africa can rise together. On this note, ladies and gentlemen, I declare the IAA's second leadership conference in Africa, Africa Rising Reloaded, officially open.
When the African people engage with communities of the world, and when you talk about branding in that context and building brands and the role of brand stewards, I believe very, very passionately that the African people must embrace all of the realities of the world, all of the resources of the world. I liked it that the president started out by saying, we are all one. I believe it extremely passionately that we are part of the global community, must see ourselves that way, but we must also always remember where we have come from. So we take from the world and we give to the world with equal confidence and equal composure. And that has to be the principle and the set of guardrails that guides people who are building brands that seek to engage and seek to resonate in the African reality. Whose center is the center? When we talk about the rise of nativism in the world, when we talk about various centers emerging, I tell my political colleagues a lot of the time when they ask, are you left-wing or right-wing? I say, it depends on where you place the center. And I don't know who is determining that center. If you tell me the center, I can tell you where I stand. But the centers also are determined by the cultural influences of the world. W. Edward Said, those of you who know about his writings, he was a professor who was very distinguished in the work that he did, used to mock the world in certain ways when he said that the Orient was created in Europe's image, and that to his mind, a huge amount of what had come out in his epic work, Orientalism, he said a huge amount of what had come to be known as the world of the Orient was actually created by detached and superficial scholars sitting in places like the London School of Economics, some of them with very skin-deep knowledge of the community that they were writing about. Orientalism, therefore, came to mean a caricature of so-called experts who knew it all, but who had very little understanding of the true lives, the true impulses, the true anxieties, the true aspirations of the people that they claim to speak for or on behalf of. As builders of brands, as people who work to extend the influence of brands that we have inherited, we all face the danger of what Said called the caricature of Orientalism. And that's something that I want us to think about. The African people specifically, when you talk about these things, sometimes it makes people uncomfortable, but of all people, if marketeers are not able to face the truth, they miss the ability to build things, ecosystems, to create organisms, to create living ecologies that are able to engage in the communities of the world and therefore become relevant. And our reality is that we have been through some experiences that as a result of their legacy causes us sometimes to have this as an inferiority complex. I know when you say it, it grates people the wrong way. Now, if you say to me that our history does not contain any traces of that, and I agree that the colonial experience was just episodic, it was a very small part of the African reality which has extended beyond millennia. Because of its contemporary influence and impact, we sometimes forget that it lasted only a few centuries and Africa has existed for millennia. But just excavate or extensively search the annals of history and you come across people like Richard Burton who uttered, in those times it was a mainstream point of view. Today it's a shocking thing to hear. But in those days, Richard Burton, 19th century explorer, said that while it is incontrovertible that the African is a part of nature, he was not sure that the African is a part of history. Incontrovertibly, Africans are a part of nature, but he was not sure that Africans were a part of history. Even more recently, the Regius Professor of History, Trevor Roper, Oxford professor, said, the history of Africa is the history of Europeans in Africa, and after that darkness, and darkness is not a subject of teaching. This is even more recently, it's just in the 60s that Roper said this. The missionary who did a huge amount of work in the African continent, Albert Schweitzer, he did a huge amount of work, and I'll hate for him to be remembered only for this statement, but it tells you the situation, the context of the times. And you will soon know why I am painting this context before I proceed. Albert Schweitzer said, the African is indeed my brother, but my junior brother. The African is indeed my brother, but my junior brother. And that occupied the intellectual energies of many of the post-colonial scholars. Edu Boahin from Ghana, Ade Ajayi, there are many Nigerians over here, Onwuka Dike, the East Africans will know about the work of Ali Mazrui. Many of the early writers who produced legends of what became known as the post-colonial literatures of Africa, Wole Soyinka, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Chinua Achebe, many of them were preoccupied with exploding some of these constructs. In fact, I've left out Frantz Fanon, who actually did a lot of his writing here in Ghana. Many of them were exploding some of these myths, and they were very occupied by it. In fact, the UNESCO General History on Africa assigns itself that task of doing a huge amount to deconstruct some of the negative impacts that had come about as a result of this experience of the African people. Some of the fallouts of that were negative. And I constantly warn the African Rising Movement, we need to be careful that we do not fall into the temptation of over-sentimentalizing the reality of Africa, of over-romanticizing the realities of Africa, because we have a precedent. That precedent was negritude. The reaction of negritude to the legacy of the inferiority complex of colonialism was to focus so much on trying to find a positive narrative about Africa that it sometimes became very disengaged and disconnected from the reality. Leopold Senghor of Senegal uttered, in my view, the unthinkable blasphemy when he said reason is Hellenic, emotion is Negro. In trying to show why, in some ways, we had not developed sufficiently the academic foundations and basis of the African reality from history, he gave this sort of excuse. A.M. Césaire would lament the people who had created nothing, and all in poetic and romantic tones. We need to learn from that. Thankfully, even in that day, there were people like Wole Soyinka who said that the tiger does not talk tigritude, it pounces. That is my message for the Africa Rising movement. The tiger does not talk tigritude, it pounces, it pounces. It does stuff, it improves its actuality, and then the narrative follows it. If you are over-focused on the narrative to an extent that you disconnect it from your reality, at some point, you start to float in midair, and you have absolutely no impact on the reality of the people and of the communities and of the societies that you're supposed to be dealing with. So it's extremely important when we talk about the African reality, and I'll keep coming back to this theme, that we are encouraged to do better than where we are, but the African reality is not all a reality of positives. And we have to have the confidence among ourselves to face our challenges, to see where we need to improve, and get on with it and do something about it, and not constantly get ourselves into a romantic warp where we encourage ourselves by saying that there are so many things that are going on, and there are so many things that are going on, but we have to face the fact that the masses, large majorities of African people are living in objectionable circumstances, and people like you and myself, who constitute the elite of Africa in many ways, must challenge ourselves about what we are going to do to ensure that the ravages of inequality, the fallout of extensive poverty are things that we are tackling, we are talking about, and we are judging our progress by how much we are able to secure broad-based prosperity for the larger society. Broad-based prosperity for the larger society, not just romantic rhetoric for a small minority, and then we hide ourselves in walls, big electric fences, because we are afraid of the communities that we live in, because we've not been able to deliver development for them. That I was here, you take many of the popular culture formats, the trends, they emerge from the informal settlements and so on. They don't come from the very organized parts of our society. And my experience has been that we have become so focused on our processes, we have become so focused on our arcane vocabulary that makes us feel intelligent and intellectual that we have lost the true connection with people. Many of us have become, in a real sense, that detached anthropologist. The way that Richard Burton, who did not understand many things about what he was seeing, said to himself that he was not sure whether the African was a part of history, but he was sure he was a part of nature. It's a funny thing to think about. He is the one that needed to be pitied, not the African people. The African people have always been a part of history. All the peoples of the world have been a part of human history. So what we need to think about, when we see people, the masses of our people, and we do not see the opportunities for advertising to lift society, to improve communities, it is we. We are the people who should be felt sorry for. In our self-importance, we are the people who have lost the connection to our communities and our societies, and for as long as we lose that connection, for just so long, we will become irrelevant. And we will talk about the threats of extinction, not realizing that it is not the world that is changing so fast around us, it is us that constantly are getting disconnected and therefore are becoming more and more irrelevant. In my own personal experience, I am constantly challenging our marketing department in the larger sense of the word. Be out there, go where the people are, go, sit there in the informal settlements, understand the things that motivate people, because the more you do, the more you know how to win in these communities. We spend a lot of time in my base in Lagos, we call it Niger centricity, because I believe in the concept of creative convergence. I don't believe that advertisers can sit by themselves, completely extinct from disconnected from the rest of the creative effort, whether they're fashion designers, artists, and just somehow be creative by themselves. You have to nourish that creativity by connecting with all the creative life that is happening around you. And as I go through, you will see that I will make a few comments in this regard. So brands in Africa must place Africans at the center of what they do. The brands that come into Africa saying that they have a global experience that has to be foisted on the African reality, regardless of what the reality in Africa is, they will just simply miss it. Of course, because we are part of human society, like all the other peoples of the world, some of that reality will, of course, resonate, but not all of it. All peoples of the world, regardless of what the sources are, they have their culture, they have their way of doing things. I'm not saying that it is static, it can be moved. But if you do not engage, if you do not respectfully try to understand, you miss it. No matter what became of him later, at the peak of his influence, Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea used to say, only the people make history, only the people make history. Not the marketing departments, not the agencies, not people sitting in disconnected realities. It is the people, and the majority of the people are not sitting in halls like this. They're out there on the streets, as we say in Lagos. So we have to connect, so we have to make sure that we are having a respectful conversation, a respectful dialogue, that we are humble enough to learn from people who may not be as formally educated as you and I are, but who have an experience of life from which we can benefit and from which we can nourish what we do in terms of brand building. I met a man recently who has influenced me in many ways. His name is Professor Father Godfrey Nzamujo. He is a polymath. He is qualified in so many things, a little bit of a molecular biologist, a physicist. He has a PhD in economic philosophy and many, many things. And I've just mentioned just a few. And he's the director of Songhai Center in Porto Novo, Benin. And I constantly stay in touch with him and occasionally visit him to try and get the stimulation that he gives to many people. An outstanding individual, but very quiet and modest. And he said this to me: the past and the future are part of the present. It is the past and the future that galvanize the present. And what I take out from Nzamujo in the context that we are having the conversation, I've touched on it already today, is that our reality is our reality. The good and the bad about Africa, those are our realities. Africa Rising as a movement and a context of brand development should recognize the things that we are not proud of and do something about them. The task of Africa Rising cannot be that we hide the things that we are not proud of from the rest of the world. It is not a sustainable strategy for going forward. The task of Africa Rising has to be that it keeps the African people confident that if we too try, we too can arrive where other peoples are and surpass them. But it cannot be that we constantly get together to say to ourselves that what should be galvanizing elements of our reality, things that we are not proud of, do not exist. The world in many ways faces challenges. It's not just the African reality. I was speaking in London 2 days ago, and I was telling them, sometimes I think the world has gone plain crazy. You take some of the food supply chains of the world, 40% of its produce is thrown away. And yet in this same world, 1 billion people, or close to that, it's now 815 million if you want to be more precise, they go to bed hungry every night. Now let's think about our own homes. The amount of food that goes into the bin. So you have a food supply chain that keeps, and this has to be a wake-up call for all of us, but it's just one example. My favorite example, I speak to people about it every opportunity I have, daily. There are 1 billion people in the world who are subjected to the indignity of open defecation. And yet the world has sufficient surplus resource to deal with this. We'll come back to more of that. So intersectionality is a concept that I learned from Angela Davis, and I like it very much because she was talking to the feminist movement in the United States and saying that you cannot look at people through just one axis. She said, I am a black woman. That is who I am. I am a woman I am black, I am an academic, I am many things. And there's a class element of me as well. So you cannot study me on one axis. So the concept of intersectionality is something that she puts out, and I like to use because when we talk about the African reality, need to see it in the same way. Africa is a part of the local reality, it is a part of the regional reality, it is a part of the global reality, and we should not be forced to choose. All the peoples of the world are able to take from a pot as they see right. I do not believe that to be African means to shut down other influences. That's wrong. Or to accept those other influences means to shut down your being African. You can be all of them at the same time. There is nobody who is going to determine for us what our identity is. Identity is a multi-variable equation from my point of view. I often don't like to read charts to people, but the reason I will do this is because I think that Amartya Sen, many people here will know about Professor Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner for economics, outstanding scholar in many ways, but I believe that he says something which the state of the broken world that we live in today, with the rise of nativism as we see in many parts of the world, really needs to hear this. A lot of the challenges that we face in the world today are because we compress people's identity into a single variable, and in doing so, we forget that we are first and foremost connected by our common humanity. That is what sustains the world at the end of the day.